Okay, everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's a hard time of the semester, but you're in for a treat. I barely need to introduce to you Professor Mark Jordan, who is the last speaker of the year in this series, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality in Religion Forum, which is largely meant to be a place in which you can have a chance to spend some time with the work of the various faculty members who are here, find out what various people are doing, and also have a kind of continuing conversation amongst ourselves, a kind of building conversation about the various issues at stake in this field. And I'm very happy to see a lot of people who I see here are people who have been coming actually through the year, and there'll be a similar series next year as well. So I didn't need to say much about Professor Jordan, since I'm sure many of you are already taking classes with him and know him. But he is Richard Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Divinity. You might have heard his lecture last week, which was his inaugural lecture, which was really wonderful. He's been here now. This is his third semester, I believe. Very, very delighted to have him. And I guess one of the most impressive things about his work is how he really stands at the top of his field, one of the leading people in Christian ethics in the country. But he's working into that position out of a very, very close study of issues relating to gender and sexuality. And so using that kind of sort of way at the sort of, in some degree, margin or out on a limb in terms of the kind of topic matter, very radical in many ways, and yet also has purchased in the sort of the mainstream of at the heart of religious studies. And so it's really wonderful and very inspiring for someone to be able to do that, and then also to be able to do it in the kind of incredibly lucid and just always brilliant manner that he does so. So it's a real treat to hear him speak tonight on the topic of Foucault, and I'm forgetting what the title is. Yeah, but you can tell us. Thank you.
In my kind of work, there's very little evidence or proof, but one of the things you get to do is to disprove almost immediately such a gorgeous introduction by showing how unlucid you are. My thanks to Janet for the introduction and for the invitation. And my thanks to all of you for coming out on a Monday evening so late in the term. Since we have all but exhausted our mortal strength for this academic year, let me speak for only about half an hour, and then we can talk to each other a bit until we fade. To become again what we never were is a phrase from the English translation of Foucault's lecture series, Hermeneutic of the Subject. The French is redevenir ce qu'on n'a jamais été. In this lecture, Foucault is explicating the Greek phrase epimeleia heautou, usually translated as care of the self. The phrase comes to him from remembered texts of ancient Mediterranean philosophy. He explains that the work of the philosophic teacher, like the work of the physician, has both a formative and a corrective function. Let me quote a bit more of the passage to put the phrase in its immediate context. We must treat ourselves already when we are young, and a doctor obviously has a greater chance of success if he is called in at the start of the illness rather than at its end. Anyway, it's always possible to be corrected, even if we are not corrected in our youth. Even if we are hardened, there are means by which we can recover, correct ourselves, and become again what we should have been, but never were. To become again what we never were is, I think, one of the most fundamental elements, one of the most fundamental themes of this practice of the self. You hear that in its adjacent context, the phrase condenses some familiar paradoxes of ethical formation considered as an event. What one truly is has to be acquired by hard labor. Ethical learning is always unlearning. Philosophic subjectivation is always a re-subjectivation. But I think that Foucault emphasizes the phrase about becoming underlines it, because it suggests something more generally significant to him about the history of subjects, especially with regard to the possibility for changing or turning one's subjectivity. To explore this fully would require us to think about Foucault's complicated relation to Nietzsche's proclamation of the eternal return, and to the proclamations retelling by French readers of Nietzsche, especially Pierre Klossowski, whom Foucault commends. We have neither the time nor, I suspect, the fresh energy for that. So let me try a simpler way. Let me juxtapose the phrase with two famous and regularly misunderstood passages in Foucault's History of Sexuality 1. After all, becoming again what we never were might well be taken as a description of the relation of many English readers to Foucault's supposedly best-known text. What would it take to become the readers of Foucault that we claim for so long to have been? Chris, if you distribute this. I had to bring a handout tonight. Such is my fatigue. The salience of History of Sexuality 1 in the English reception of Foucault has something to do with the history of translation and mistranslation. Foucault's first major work, History of Madness, which offers many keys to reading him, was not available in English until 3.5 years ago. Indeed, the paperback edition of History of Madness just appeared in English at the beginning of this month. But it's also true that the translation and marketing of History of Sexuality 1 in English made it seem something it was not. In French, it is an ironic little book, a self-correcting preface, a stylized polemic filled with formal allusions, including from its opening words to Proust, who counts in this case both as the narrator of memory and as the critic of changing sexual categories. The opening section of Proust's Sodom and Gomorrah, known in English under a more prudish scriptural allusion as Cities of the Plain, the opening of Proust's Sodom and Gomorrah registers the relatively recent appearance of the category homosexual in French by surrounding it with much older vocabularies, biblical, racial, and natural historical, or horticultural, to be precise. But in English, Foucault's little book has to be a manifesto, or rather, a new scripture. It can't be just a rewriting of an introduction by Proust. It has to be something more. It was first required to authorize revisionist gay history, as if Foucault had written a history of sex, and then to provide axioms for queer theory, as if he had promulgated a theoretical dogma about sexuality, when he had in fact done everything to show its insubstantiality, its spectral mystifications. Let me try to show how these required misreadings play out in two passages. The first is perhaps the most tediously familiar passage in Foucault for English readers. You know the passage I mean, the one that begins in Hurley's immortal mistranslation, as defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. The 19th century homosexual becomes a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood. You can doubtless recite the rest of the passage from memory. In case your scriptural education has been forgotten or repressed, I supply a clumsy retranslation in the first text on the handout. I actually remember David Halpern leading a public recitation of this passage from memory at the MLA. Right. So, these are the scriptural verses that are supposed to authorize queer theory's indispensable distinction between homoerotic acts and identities. Of course, the authorizing passage doesn't address that distinction, even in Hurley's mistranslation. It doesn't quite say what we know it must say, a frequent embarrassment in scriptures. The word identity doesn't occur in it at all, and it occurs elsewhere in History of Sexuality 1 only rarely, and then with its arithmetical meaning, identity as equality, or in ironic quotation of Foucault's adversaries, identity as misapprehension. But if not acts and identities, it is hard to know exactly what the passage names. Indeed, in order to make sense of it, we must resort to that old trick of scriptural exegetes, the collation of parallels. Parallel passages can be found nearby in Foucault's lectures on abnormals, then at some distance in his History of Madness. A collation of parallels will not only clarify the disputed verses in History of Sexuality 1, it will also suggest how much they leave out. The central contrast in this passage is not between acts and identities, but between the sodomite as juridical subject of forbidden acts and the homosexual as a medicalized personage, a personage with a predictable history, a characteristic morphology, and perhaps even an abnormal physiology. The contrast is between the mere imputation of legal culpability and the scientific construction of a new identity, we want to say, but the text does not. The contrast finds a parallel in Foucault's lectures on abnormals, which were given in the years just before the publication of History of Sexuality 1. There he argues that one function of 19th century psychiatric expertise is to double the author of the offense with the new personage of the delinquent, previously unknown to the 18th century. The psychiatry of delinquency goes beyond the expertise required by earlier legislation, which sought a determination only of whether the author of the act was still a responsible juridical subject. So in the 18th century, Foucault says all the expert had to pronounce was whether the person accused of the offense was a responsible subject in the eyes of the law. But in the 19th century, the new forensic psychiatry is required to diagnose that the person is a new sort of subject, namely a delinquent. You can hear the exact resemblance of language between that passage and this passage on the sodomite and homosexual. The personage of the homosexual doubles the sodomite as author of the act, creates an ethico-moral double, Foucault says in the lectures, an individual who is the bearer of a character with specified traits, rather than the juridical subject of a legally defined offense. In our scripture, the doubling is accomplished by positing a perversion hiding behind the sexual acts. Like its 19th century cousins, instinct and degeneration, perversion commits its unfortunate bearers to lifelong medical surveillance as members of a new species of pathology, which now stretches far beyond the limits of mere bodily pathogens. These and other parallels clarify the central contrast in our scripture from History of Sexuality 1. They also help resolve a long-running exegetical dispute. What is the historical range of the contrast in that first passage you have before you? Dispute over our passage has scoured the last 25 centuries of Western history in support of ingenious arguments about how the modern homosexual might or might not differ from all earlier figures. But the parallels suggest that Foucault is offering a very restricted comparison and a typically ironic claim of newness. Foucault here juxtaposes only a 19th century medical character with an 18th century legal subject. The word ancien does not refer to ancient or pre-modern text, but only to whatever jurisprudential period precedes the mid-19th century, that is, precedes the Revolution. This is typical of Foucault's use of canon law, that is, church law, before History of Sexuality 1. In Abnormals, Foucault depicts counter-Reformation confessional practices, mostly from two French handbooks published at the beginning of the 17th century. Earlier, in History of Madness, he had relied for church law on Paulo Zacchias' Questiones Medico-Legales, composed in the first half of the 17th century. So his recurring contrast is 17th or 18th century with 19th century, not Athenian antiquity with 19th century, not medieval sodomite with 19th century. By tightening the historical contrast, we can avoid some of the sillier historical misreadings of the kind you find in Richter, Norton, or Camille Paglia. Foucault is not saying that there were no males before the 19th century who preferred to copulate with other males rather than females, that there were no earlier homoerotic habits or institutions or artworks or discourses, and so on. We avoid such historical misreadings, but historical questions remain. What does happen to the narrow contrast between 18th century juridical subject and 19th century homosexual personage if we place it within a longer story, something more like the story Foucault himself tells in History of Madness? Here's the beginning of one answer. As soon as you try to expand the narrow contrast between 18th and 19th century, the juridical subject of canon law becomes immensely more complicated. Foucault reduces the complications of church traditions in History of Madness and Abnormals by arguing that one or two modern texts represent many. Foucault says of Zacchias, that 17th century canonist, for example, that he summed up all Christian jurisprudence that related to the question of madness, and then more astonishingly, Foucault says that Zacchias was the inheritor of the whole tradition of Christian law. This is a startling simplification for someone so attentive to shifts and ruptures in fields of knowledge, because of course Zacchias no more sums up the traditions of Western church law than Tuque and Pinel sum up earlier discourses about madness. On the contrary, Zacchias adheres to a peculiarly modern project that evaluates the juridical subject into its discrete acts formulated as moral cases. Let me push this a little bit further. I'm simply trying to show that if you try to expand this narrow contrast, almost immediately some of Foucault's own notions become problematic. If we look beyond Zacchias, we have to begin to wonder whether it was only at the middle of the 19th century that the juridical subject of sodomy was doubled as a medicalized ethico-moral subject. In the history of Christian theology and church law, the figure of the sodomite precedes the abstract category of sodomy. Indeed, a sodomite's sins can be left so usefully vague, as Foucault knows, precisely because the figure is defined by a biblical narrative that does not mention particular sexual acts. Later theology increasingly elaborates the figure of the sodomite apart from acts, and nowhere more than in the text that fixed, and I think invented, the abstract word sodomy, the 11th century Liber Gomorrhianus, or Gomorran book by Peter Damian, from which text let me briefly construct a comparison with Foucault's description of the 19th century homosexual. Foucault says that the homosexual has a past, a history, that is a series of gender inversions. So too do Peter Damian's sodomites, who are for him, as for so much of Christian tradition, only male. In this respect, at least, Foucault is a good Catholic. The sodomites' history is the compelled repetition of their dreadful tribe, which somehow escaped God's scorching wrath only to continue disrupting natural gender. The homosexual has a character, a type of life, So too do Peter Damien's sodomites, who build a shadowy community. Sodomitic bishops and priests beget children by preaching and baptism, only to corrupt them by copulation and then absolve them in confession. It's very convenient to be able to be absolved by your lover. The homosexual has a morphology with an anatomy and perhaps a physiology. Peter Damien, too, speaks at length about sodomitic bodies, which are intrinsically morbid and pathological. Sodomy is likened to the cause of plagues or plague itself, to a tumorous growth, a wound or wounded member, a raging contagion, an aggressive contagious disease. It is compared at length in its attendant rituals and consequences with leprosy. What is more striking, for Peter Damien, sodomitic desire is madness. Sodomites are rightly classed with the insane, not least because their speech is gibberish. Here, Peter Damien repeats a commonplace of the Latin theological tradition. According to Jerome, patron of Latin scriptural commentators, the place name Sodom means mute beast. Sodomites lose rationality by acting bestially against human nature. That is why, according to Peter Damien, the activity of sodomites is to be silenced among Christians. Theirs is the nameless sin or crime because it cannot speak. Once we try to expand the narrow historical range in the passage from History of Sexuality 1, we will quickly be reminded of the links between sodomy and madness. We will then remember that Foucault's own history of madness also describes what it calls homosexuals before the 19th century. Figures of homoerotic desire are confined alongside the mad, and by the time Pinel arrives to liberate them, I mean to bind them with better chains, their desire has become fused with madness. So in History of Madness, Foucault himself uses the term homosexual to describe a portion of the population that was incarcerated and then liberated and reincarcerated well before the 19th century. Foucault himself breaks his own chronology in History of Sexuality 1. That's the puzzle. How different, as historical writing, is the narrow binary contrast of our scripture in History of Sexuality 1 from the punctuated circling, the disappearances and returns of History of Madness. The earlier book also recounts a succession of figures, but their sequences are always haunted by missing faces. Madness moves alongside the figures that are imposed on it, moves through them as ghost, profile, silhouette, but it does move through them. That is the point. It is never a definitively surpassed identity. Madness cannot be captured by any scheme of knowledge, much less by the efforts to confine or expel it. In contrast, the narrative line of History of Sexuality 1 is suspiciously linear, as if it could only replace the fable of our overcoming Victorian repression with an equally simple fable, or as if Foucault had forgotten all the punning ambivalence in his use of histoire. The two titles align, History of Madness, History of Sexuality. But wait. History of Sexuality 1 is not yet a history. It is a preparation for a history that was never written because it could not be written as originally conceived. The task of preparation is indicated by the subtitle, The Will to Knowledge, a Nietzschean caution, a Nietzschean denunciation. History of Sexuality 1 provides a mocking antidote to our epistemic prejudices about the sort of narrative a history of sex must be, about what sort of doctrine a revolutionary theology of sexuality must supply. Surely the story of sexuality must pass from ignorance to knowledge, beginning as a grim tale of repression only to culminate in the sexual revolution of our luminous present. I mean, we have progressed so far as to proclaim gay liberation since June 28, 1969. Indeed, we have. And through that proclamation, Foucault claims, we confine ourselves more completely within the will to sexual knowledge, to scientia sexualis, that also animated the forensic psychiatry of the 19th century perversions. It is our will to knowledge about sex, about history, that must be exposed before we can even begin the history of sexuality. But after this preparation, Foucault does not begin, perhaps because the intended starting place in the 17th century was haunted by missing figures, by ghosts, silhouettes, stigmatized bodies from the centuries-old Christian pastoral, haunted as much as any history of madness by obscure cycles of enclosure and return, reclassification and return, sexual revolution and return. The sodomite, among other figures of the mad, refuses to disappear on schedule with the proclamation of the homosexual, and will not be severed from his acts by contemporary Christian casuistry, which has itself recently learned to talk about homosexuals and their problematic condition. So that the pure clinical newness of the homosexual as proclamation of a new science of sex, is shadowed, is also inevitably a return of an earlier figure. The homosexual becomes again what the sodomite never was. Perhaps, too, Foucault refused to write the history because he needed still to correct in himself certain expectations of historical narrative, had still to answer his own call for history to be parodic, dissociative, and sacrificial, rather than monumental, antiquarian, and reformist. In History of Madness and Abnormals, I suggested, Foucault offers curiously simple plots of the history of Christian pastoral power. For example, he tells the progress of confessional practice with an antiquarian's emphasis on continuity, and then suggests that the practice has remained unchanged in the Catholic Church since the 17th century. The practice of confession has remained unchanged in the Catholic Church since the 17th century. Either a joke or a monumentalist suggestion, if there ever was one. The same impulses to simplify religious history appear in some interviews, though I can never take Foucault's interviews quite at face value. I think in the interviews he's always wearing at least 6 masks. But in a series of originally anonymous conversations with a young hitchhiker, Foucault recalls nostalgically what church power used to be. He jokes that he is the only one who remains interested in the daily operation of the Catholic Church in France. In these teasing remarks, he both performs and mocks the desire for origins, continuities, and finalities that animates reformist history writing. Of course, it's not only hitchhikers that Foucault loves to tease. Perhaps we should return to History of Sexuality 1 with other eyes or ears. Perhaps we have been listening to it, scrutinizing it with entirely inappropriate seriousness. Certainly the little book is characterized by its archness, by its practice and preoccupation with mockery, especially in what are supposed to be its most lyrical passages. So I turn to the second passage on the sheet, which I promise not to go through in equivalent detail. I turn to the second passage on the sheet and to the little book's famous ending. I have retranslated the last 50 lines or so of the French. And if you don't have a copy, don't worry. I will repeat with relish the most important parts. Yeah. We are in the book's final section. It begins with a quotation from D.H. Lawrence, which ends with this exhortation. Now our business is to realize sex. Let me read that again. I actually think the emphasis falls differently. Now our business is to realize sex. Today, the full conscious realization of sex is even more important than the act itself. Dear friends, this is not Foucault's view, though that is in fact the way Foucault is often read. This is Foucault quoting Lawrence ironically, that is, mockingly. From this quotation, Foucault proceeds to wonder aloud how a statement like Lawrence's, how our whole regime of sexuality will look from some unspecified future, how it will be remembered not in Proustian reactivation, but in ironic puzzlement. Foucault begins to imagine future teasing of our self-understanding, future astonishment at our dogmatic certainty about where we stand in the longue durée of the category of sexuality. Note, please, the play of time, of imagining a future that judges the judgments we pass on ourselves. Through this imagining, we become again what we never understood ourselves to be. Notice as well the temporality implied in how this final passage depicts sexuality. Sexuality in it is called an ombre, a shadow, yes, but also a ghost, like the ghost of the mad in Foucault's telling of the history of psychiatry. There will come a time in which the now reigning sexuality, the fetishized category of our inmost truth, will come to seem ghostly, in which its austere monarchy will be disclosed as the curious reign of King Ubu, the object of Jarry's satires, but also a key figure in Foucault's characterization of 19th century forensic psychiatry of sex. In his lectures on abnormals, some of you have heard me refer to this passage. In his lectures on abnormals, Foucault reads out some expert psychiatric testimony from court records, and the audience begins to laugh at the pompous diagnoses and dogmatic evaluations. Foucault pauses. It's an astonishing moment. Foucault pauses to remark that there is a certain laughable, grotesque power that makes us laugh, even as it judges our life and sentences us to death. He calls this power Ubu-esque, after King Ubu from Jarry. I think that Ubu's monarchy returns in these final lines of History of Sexuality 1. Austere monarchy, which is often read as a reference to Victoria's reign and the repressive hypothesis, is also, I think, the Ubu-esque power of a monarchy which is laughable, but which also has the power of life and death. These lines are often read as one of Foucault's few gestures of hopefulness. I hate to take that away from you. So some people take him as suggesting, for example, that there are possibilities for recreating ourselves as sexual subjects in micro-communities of resistance. Then these lines are tied to his remarks elsewhere on how certain queer communities, say in the leather bars of San Francisco's Soma, at least as it was before gentrification, how certain communities invent new forms of bodily pleasure, so that these lines become a sort of revolutionary exhortation to sexual transgression as a means of resubjectivation, sexual transgression as a means of remaking ourselves. Perhaps. Only what is missing from that reading is the deep irony of this passage, its camp sarcasm. Certainly, Foucault does not intend to exhort us to make new identities for our sexualities, to proclaim our liberation as leather fetishists say, to submit ourselves to the humorless and ceaseless declaration of our true sexual selves in yet another taxonomy of knowable categories. Another economy of bodies and pleasures, a phrase from this. That phrase does not mean the old handkerchief code of gay bars or the standardized categories of manhunt profiles or the obligatory abbreviations of sexting. As Foucault says at the very end, irony of this apparatus, it makes us believe that our liberation is at stake. If Foucault is endlessly sarcastic about the pieties of gay liberation, vintage 1970, and he is, one can only imagine his irrepressible laughter at our latest claims to have liberated sexuality at last by reducing it to standardized telegraphy. No, if there is exhortation in these lines, if there is a gesture towards erotic resubjectivation, it comes within the camp conceit of an imagined future remembering a self-deceiving past. Becoming again what we never were is, after all, a conundrum, that is, a riddle, at once paradoxical and playful. It is an exhortation to open a space within which sex could be stylized precisely because it is no longer so urgently ontological, so inescapably identificatory, so much the final metaphysics of the true self. Becoming again what we never were means renouncing revolution and its grand theory for a work that looks more like an aesthetics of local memory, an oddly framed reperformance, an improbable drag. By putting these papers into your hands, by poring over these passages with you, I have intended to implicate you in the reading of Foucault, but also in an exhortation towards future reading. I've wanted to pose a question of which Foucault was acutely aware about the relation of retrieved documents to lives. A psychiatric dossier for a 19th century homosexual diagnoses a lived past by reducing it to ashes. It simultaneously predicts it requires that the diagnosed identity be enacted, be declared. If queer theory means the expert reduction of a past and the dogmatic imposition of a future, then queer theory replicates the form of the psychiatric dossier. It is no escape. It is concealed repetition. Only let me not make the contrast with escape. Let me suggest rather a question for future reading. How can the reading of a prelude to a history of our cherished category of sexuality, a prelude written as Proustian camp, open a politically or ethically effective space for embodied resistance to the powers that run through the category of sexuality? With this question, we might begin to become readers of Foucault, and perhaps even something other than the imposed identities we never were and yet must forever be. Thank you. I will. And I apologize for my voice, as some of you know. And for the masochists in this audience who have heard me speak in public 3 times in the last 4 weeks, I can only say that this adds 2 years to your therapy sentence. But my apologies for the raspy voice. I would be happy to take questions, objections. Professor Dr. Hollywood.
Thank you. And now when I say that I think this is what Mark thinks about Foucault, I have something to go on my pure speculation. But one of the things I'm wondering about is whether, I'm thinking about the end of History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and this passage you cite here, and the endless ionization of the notion of liberation that's at stake here. And, and he puts a certain conception of liberation under the name of Freud, right, which he's both doing and not doing. But the unspoken figure, right, is Lacan, and one of the unspoken figures is Lacan, and part of his relationship with Lacan is I see Lacan as engaging in the same perpetual ionization of any claim to monumental history, any claims to the truth of the subject, any claims to the saturatability of analysis, and yet and yet one of the things, and he's always having to enact, he writes himself and enacts his mastery even as he's trying to undermine it. There's this kind of constant thing operated in Lacan, and it's a problematic. Can you do that? Can you stand in the position of the master while simultaneously evacuating the site? And it seems to me there's something of that in Foucault too, so that it's not just that people are misreading, although there are gross mistranslations, I mean, no question about that. But I'm wondering if there's not something in Foucault, especially when he has some of his more lyrical flights, sometimes it's clear what's ironic, and sometimes I think it's not. And I wonder whether that might not have something, I mean, any of the places you point to, it is, but I wonder whether there might not be something in Foucault of, he's trying to displace the presumed mastery of Lacan, right, in order to ironize the very notion of that kind of full disclosure, and yet doesn't he himself have to take up the voice of the master in order to do that, and does that render unstable, right, his own deployment of irony to shape the system, if that makes any sense.
No, I agree. I think Foucault is, sometimes he retreats from the instability of his magisterial voice, and marks it explicitly. The famous opening of his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, where he says, in effect, I wish I could begin speaking without speaking. I wish I could slip into speech with the voice of Jean-Paul. I mean, it's the whole anxiety of beginning to talk and wanting to talk through the voice of another. Or the places where the masked philosopher interview, where he makes very clear, sort of, whenever I'm talking, there are 6 masks at least. But then at other places, in the interviews certainly, but also in these lyrical passages, which begin as early as History of Madness, right, which has these extraordinary, beautiful passages in which you think the end of the book is going to be a vindication of Dostoevsky, Artaud, Nietzsche. There's a number of figures who appear as these kind of cracking voices that register madness, but it never comes, of course. And so he gestures, doesn't fulfill, he mocks his own speaking, but then he gives interviews in which he's very emphatic about the politics. The only thing I think that I would add to that, so I'm saying, yes, I agree. I think Foucault is constantly in the middle of anxieties and vanities about his own speaking. When you add to that the demand that History of Sexuality 1 become either the Manifesto of Gay Liberation or the Sacred Scripture of Queer Theory, you have completely lost the play.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yes, please.
Just to add to that, I think one of the difficulties that we come up against is this notion of a deployment of irony, right? Which in some ways presupposes that there is some sort of subject or some sort of author who can use irony to his or her own advantage. Whereas I think in some ways what you seem to be saying, what's happening with Foucault's text, is that there really isn't a subject that is pre-existent to the irony. That irony in some ways empties out the notion of authority or some sort of agency that goes into some sort of deployment of different literary tropes.
No, I think that's right. And one of the things that went off in my mind, in fact, as I was reading this again, is when he uses the word author, when he describes both the delinquent and the homosexual as the author of acts. And when you know what Foucault has done with the word author, right, you have to read that as being itself an ironic remark. But you're quite right, and I think however you want to parse out the complex relations between what Foucault says about authors and Foucault's practice of writing, very complicated relations, whatever you want to say about that, I think what you at least have to grant is that when Foucault is being most careful to describe that, the irony always precedes its deliberate deployment. The language always is there first, and the author, as it were, steps into the flow of it, is constituted by the flow of it. Now, it can sometimes be very hard to put that together with the specificity of Foucault's compositional voice. In the Collège de France lecture, for example, having said, oh, I wish that I didn't have to begin speaking, that I could slip into speech behind the voice of my revered master, Foucault goes on to write pages that only Foucault could write in that absolutely distinctive voice. So I think that too is constantly in flux. But I agree with you that we can never, as it were, imagine the deployment of something like irony in Foucault as a deliberate choice or device by a pre-existent author. There are certain advantages to coming late in the semester. Yes, please.
This might be a slightly unfair question, because I'm going to link something I've heard you say in previous times, that you're looking to move away from speaking about sexuality into rather talking about bodies and pleasure, that sexuality as a category is almost flawed. And are you seeing that here in the conclusion where grand theories of liberation fail and we're left with local communities of memory performing some form of communal drag? Is that a move away from sexuality as a thing as such into discussions of body and pleasure?
Yeah, I think what I would say, thank you for that. I think what I would say is that, how many ways can I qualify this? I think I would say that I surely agree with Foucault. I learned from Foucault the dangers of the category of sexuality as a projected essence of what we truly are, that we now must all have and declare and enact. I think that's, in some sense, the easier part, to say that that's what we have to get rid of. The harder part is to understand, even textually, what he's gesturing towards when he uses the phrase bodies and pleasures. And as you know, some people take that as saying what he's talking about, what he says in some interviews, is the use of, is the discovery of other parts of the body than the genitals as sites of erotic pleasure. So for some people, when he says bodies and pleasures, what he's talking about is non-genital sexual pleasure. That seems to me much too simple. I think what he's trying to do is, in some way, maybe there's a little Deleuze going on here, or some passages in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche advocates that we stay on the surface of the skin rather than getting too deep in our ontology. I think what he's gesturing towards is the idea of of bodies and pleasures without metaphysics. Sexual pleasures not shadowed by the projection of an ontology of sexuality or any other ontology. It's not getting rid of sexuality so that we could put a better and truer essence in its place. It's trying to get out of the regime in which sexuality must be an essence. Now, I want to be clear at the same time that Foucault is also, when he's pressed on this point, as he was frequently pressed on this point by French liberationists and American liberationists, Foucault is absolutely willing to say things like, yes, it's a good thing that people should be liberated from oppressive criminal law. Yes, it's a good thing that people should, so he's perfectly willing to talk the language of liberation and even to use some of the discourse of sexuality as a kind of political lever. But I think he's extremely worried. He's watching in a very short space of time this political device become a new metaphysics. And I would add, not too far, I think, from Foucault, a new theology. That is one of my more bizarre notions, is I think that queer theory has shaped itself exactly to fit the empty space carved out by the disappearance of Christian theology as a cultural force. So it answers the same sort of question, provides the same consolations, claims the same dogmatic certainty, provides us a viaticum, a food for the road in order to take us into the next life, right? Yeah, so I would say move away from sexuality, yes. Towards what? There's the difficulty. Yeah. Yes?
I might be asking you to talk about some of the same things in different words. So But it seems to me that a lot of this comes down to what is the relationship between a body and a way of life. And I mean, I would say bodies and pleasures and a way of life, but I'm even like hesitant to include pleasures there just yet. I feel like those are two sort of separate questions. And so I was wondering what you had to say about that. Sort of, rather than sort of creating this genital or non-genital binary, when we begin to talk about bodies and pleasures, like what, as you read Foucault, is the relationship between the body and the way of life?
I think that connection is very deep, if I'm understanding your question. That is, I think if you ask, for example, what is the stuff that is resubjectivated? What is the thing that pivots from one subject formation to another in philosophic formation? I think the answer is the body. What is the conduit for many of the lessons that he describes in the schools of antiquity or in Christian monasteries? It's the body. And so the body, I think, is central as, in some sense, the target and the engine of resubjectivation. But as soon as you begin to go beyond that, into more specificity, you find yourself, I think, falling very quickly either into one of the approved languages or into some shadow of them. Let me see if I can say that more clearly. The obvious question in Foucault is, why do I have to be anything in order to like certain sexual pleasures? Why does my liking certain sexual pleasures imply anything about an identity, character, physiology, history, future, family of origin, etc., etc.?
You don't really want, right?
Right, or we don't. I want it Tuesday and not Wednesday, right? But why do I have to project, why do I have to double the juridical subject of the act with a diagnosis? Okay, but that is a movement of negation, right, of stripping away. It's much more difficult, I think, to say what comes next. And I think even in Foucault, there's no notion that the mere negation would, under present conditions of speech, be able to stand against the rush of other descriptions coming in. Let me say that in English. There's no reason in Foucault to suppose that someone saying, I just want bodies and pleasures, would be able in the next instant to resist the 100 types of speech that would instruct that. Right. So I think even in Foucault, outside of these lyrical, ironic passages, the question is, what speech do you put in its place? Right? What do you say next? It's very hard, I think, to answer that textually from Foucault. Although I think what he's working on at the very end of his life, in the lectures, going back to the schools of philosophy, is an answer for that question in the form of a continuing practice of pedagogy. What do you put in place? 30 years of work with a philosophic teacher. That is a very long ascesis, a practice of ascesis. I have a slightly different proposal. I'm all for rehabilitating the sodomite. And because I don't think the sodomite has disappeared, because I think that in present historical context, the sodomite has all kinds of anti-modern properties. It can fly, it can leap tall buildings, go through walls. I'm interested in the possibility, and I'm interested in Foucault's reaction to the possibility of a reactivation or ironic re-inhabitation. And one of the questions I would put to Foucault, if he were still with us, or if he had written and published the 4th and 5th volumes of the History of Sexuality, is why in History of Madness do you allow for the return of the ghost of the mad, but not in the History of Sexuality? Why do you not allow for the return of certain ghosts from before sexuality? Unless maybe he does.
Maybe it's not right.
Yes. Yeah. Chris, yeah.
So, if the negative fruit of the misreading of Foucault has been manhunt, one might argue the positive fruit has been man savage, right? The possibility of projecting, yes, these ontological characters of people with kinks who can therefore be given useful sex advice by the new radio preacher of America's queers. Does this new reading Foucault provide, is it a prolegomena to all future ethical sex advice, or is it its impossibility?
I think it's impossibility, but in a very particular way. I don't think it makes sense to ask for ethical sex advice. Not because it doesn't make sense to ask for ethics. That's crucial in Foucault, and becomes more crucial, I think, in the lectures from the 80s. It's the category of sex that's the problem. If you're just asking for ethical sex advice, you've cast it in such a way that no intelligible answer can be given. That every answer that's given will reinforce the problem. Because much more important for Foucault than the question of what can I do with certain members of my body, with whom, for how long, and with what lighting, is the question: why are you categorizing those bodily parts or those bodily pleasures in such a way? What is the pre-existent moralizing of sex that's happened? And so in that sense, I would say it's the undoing of ethical sex advice as sex advice, not as ethical. Right? Here I agree very, very emphatically with my colleague, Lynn Huffer from Emory, who has a marvelous new book called Mad for Foucault, in which she ends, I think, by arguing, I think just in the most compelling way, that to read ethics out of Foucault, to read Foucault as a nihilist, for example, is simply to have missed the long arc of the writing. I would say it makes as much sense to read Foucault as a nihilist as reading Nietzsche as a nihilist. It's such a complete misreading, in some sense, of the preoccupation. Does that make sense? I've danced away from your question, but yeah.
That's all right. It's not an answerable question, I know.
Yeah. Although I do like the idea of a syndicated national column called Non-Sex Ethical Advice. Yeah.
Can I just connect back to the irony thing for 1 second? Because I realize this when you, in what you were just saying, I realize that this is what's bothering me. I actually would disagree pretty strongly with the notion that one doesn't deploy irony, and that, irony always, as you put it, that the irony always precedes the speaking subject. That may be right. I don't know. But the question is whether by staying on surfaces, by having a sexuality without ontology, without physics, is it also without a psyche, right? And if it isn't without a psyche, then sure, we can't talk about intentionality, and irony is out of the control of the author. But it's also, there also is something to which irony can be, there's something against which we understand a particular utterance to be ironic. And without that, there's the danger that sort of every utterance becomes ironic with any fulfilling purpose. And I don't hear that as what you want to say.
No, or that none, or that no utterance becomes ironic. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's my issue. Or what I'm worrying about in terms of one combination.
Yeah, this is a much longer and very interesting conversation, which is Foucault's quarrel with Freud. Right. And that quarrel is central, of course, to History of Madness. And I don't think Foucault wavers much in that judgment, even over 20 years or 25 years of writing. So that he continues to read Freud as the more or less direct extension of the 19th century forensic psychiatry that he criticizes as being itself a direct extension of the revolutionary program of establishing the asylum, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is I don't think, some people try to, in some sense, defend Foucault as a reader of Freud by saying, well, what he's really talking about is the psychiatric establishment in France. No. he thinks that he's talking about Freud, and even will make gestures, kind of ameliorating gestures in certain passages in which he says, I understand that there are these and these complexities in Freud, but the program, the therapeutic program, the psychoanalytic program is the object of the critique. So then the question becomes for Foucault, how to talk about psyche or psychic depth or self when all the available language has been taken by a program with which you disagree. And in that sense, I think the problem with psyche is the mirror or perhaps the shadow of the problem of bodies and pleasures.
Yeah.
It's the impossibility of finding an alternate language under present circumstances. But I quite agree, and where I would locate, actually, one place where he does talk about this, interestingly enough, is in the, when he's talking about archives, right? Archived lives, the famous Lives of Infamous Men essay. And there what becomes clear is that Foucault's a kind of horror at the reduction of the complexity of a life to this archival trace, especially if it's a diagnostic archival trace. And in that passages like it, life is functioning like the word psyche. Right? Life is what's carrying the richness of it. As in other passages, body is what's carrying the richness. Yeah, go ahead, or do you want me to stop?
No. I just wanted to write down what you said before I asked my other question. I did not that archive essay, but anyway, I just a very simple question that even if you couldn't give sex advice, is it the case that Foucault believes that if you understand, I'm going to put this in really simple terms, if you understand his ethics, you'll have a better sex life? Or if you practice his ethics?
I think I would want to say yes, in this sense, that I think that Foucault, one of the things he means by austere monarchy is that we punish ourselves by depriving ourselves of pleasure when we turn sexuality into a metaphysical obligation. So that the obligation to assume the identity, in fact, robs us of pleasure. And in that sense, to be freed from the obligation of the austere monarchy, to be freed from subjection to the austere monarchy, would be an increase. But I think more than the increase in pleasure, what he's interested in is just the opening of one's eyes, right? Yeah, to alternate possibilities, to alternate, radically different conceptions of bodies and pleasures. Yeah.
Yeah, I was sort of looking for the positive, so, to be free from the austere monarchy is still like a negative term.
Well, no. I mean, enlightenment isn't a negative term, is it?
You mean in the Buddhist sense?
Yes.
Let's not go there, but I was thinking about Buddhist, metaphysics and all that kind of stuff. There's so many things to say, but no, just in terms of free from something is still like you're rejecting something, as opposed to just among the conversation I was having before, it was like we're told what we shouldn't be doing, but how can we be told what we should be doing? And that's why I was wondering if somehow, in a very general sense, the sort of understanding or embodying or practicing his ethical vision, what came along with it was actually.
Right. Although I still would want to dwell on the fact that being free from this, being free from the austere monarchy is being free from a self-imposed illusion, and a very punishing self-imposed illusion. So, yeah.
I like that very much, and it makes sense to me, but I'm also wondering, I guess first whether you think, Foucault thinks, that anything can be done without metaphysics, and so including sexuality, can it be completely drained metaphysical character? And what I'm guessing from your answer before is no, not really, insofar as even when you say bodies metaphysical significance given to it, and even some of these categorizations placed upon it, as constraining and oppressive as they are, I do think that certain spaces for pleasure are always opened up by taboos and by what's forbidden.
No, absolutely. And in that sense, what we think of as the Foucauldian dictum that power is always productive, never merely repressive, but always productive. And productive in several ways, not just that it brings about resistance, new forms of resistance, but that it also suggests new possibilities for transgression or for alternate improvisation. I think all of that is very much true. And it may be that, so look, one way of reading, one kind of way that would combine several strands that we have in the conversation would be to say that the last pages of History of Sexuality 1 are the description of a realized eschaton. That is, he's not describing some future. He's using the projection of a future looking back at the present to make a kind of linguistic dislodging or disconcerting that allows us to see in the present bodies and pleasures that are being improvised. And what that would do would be to join the communities of resistance language, the heterotopias language, with this language of the future is going to laugh at us for what we take so seriously, with the kind of mocking language about the austere monarchy. I think that's actually a very helpful way, as long as you don't, in the next second, make the communities of resistance into a revolutionary credo. Because, maybe the thing is to strike the word metaphysics and to put in the word politics with a very particular sense that would have had for Foucault, right? That is a revolutionary theory, right? What we want is practices of resistance without a revolutionary theory and all the drama that it projects. Dear friends, we may have reached the absolute limit of our mortal resistance and energy for tonight. I do thank you all for coming out.